Did you know that back in 2022, there were over 125,000 violent conflict events globally?
Wow.
Yeah, leading to more than 145,000 reported deaths. And the economic hit was huge, something like 12.9% of global GDP. That's apparently up 326% since 2008.
That's staggering. Just enormous numbers.
They really are. And they're not just statistics, right? They represent these huge disruptions that just ripple out everywhere.
Welcome to the deep dive.
Mm.
Today, we're plunging into something really critical, but maybe not always top of mind. How multinational companies, MNEs, actually navigate violent conflict.
Mm-hmm.
We're drawing a lot today from a paper called Violent Conflict in Multinational Enterprises, Identifying Key Frontiers in International Business Policy Research by Chung Liu, Lorraine Eden, and Dan Lai. So our mission today is really to unpack this complex link between global business and violent conflict. We want to get past the headlines, understand the real exposure, the strategies they use, the actual impact.
Because what this paper suggests is, well, navigating conflict is way more complicated than just avoiding danger zones. Distance doesn't always mean safety, and company actions, even good ones, can have these unexpected results.
Yeah, absolutely. And maybe just to start, let's be clear what we mean by violent conflict here.
Good idea.
We're talking about the purposeful use of violence.
Hmm.
So state actors, non-state actors, using violence for political goals. And that fundamentally messes up the whole institutional environment.
Okay, so things like civil wars, interstate wars, terrorism.
Exactly. But we're trying to distinguish that from, say, violence from drug cartels or organized crime, where the main driver isn't primarily political.
Got it.
And it's truly global. I mean, in 2021, these conflicts affected 1.7 billion people. That's almost 20% of everyone on the planet. And it's definitely not just happening in the poorest countries.
And what's really interesting about M&Es here is this kind of dual nature they have.
Mhm.
Well, because they operate globally, they're just inherently more exposed to these threats, right, all over
Yeah.
the world.
Sure, that makes sense.
But at the same time, they often have more flexibility, more experience maybe, to adapt or, relocate, even rejig their whole supply chain if they need to.
So a kind of vulnerability, but also capacity.
Exactly. It's this paradox. It's not just about avoiding trouble. It's about how they manage this tension. So, okay, if MNEs are caught up in this, how exactly do these conflicts actually hit them? It's probably not always just being physically close to the fighting, is it?
Oh, definitely not.
Hmm.
I mean, the traditional way of thinking often saw conflict as sort of geographically contained,
Yeah.
a geo-bounded risk.
Right, like a localized problem.
Yeah. But what our sources argue is that we need a much, much broader view. It goes way beyond just the immediate area.
Okay, so let's unpack that.
Right.
On one side, you've got what they call distance-based exposure.
Mm-hmm.
This is the more obvious one, I guess. Direct geographical closeness of a company's assets, buildings, factories, equipment to where the conflict is actually happening.
Right.
And the paper points out two things here. There's like exposure to just one incident, a single event. But then there's also the buildup, right? The impact of lots of incidents happening at once or over time.
Kind of a dynamic exposure.
Yeah, exactly. Like
Yeah.
the difference between, I don't know, one small tremor versus constant aftershocks.
Makes sense.
And here's a fascinating little twist they mention. Even if you're the same distance away, being just outside a war-torn country's border might mean less exposure than being just inside.
Interesting.
It's a hypothesis, though. They say it still really needs to be properly tested.
Okay, so that's distance. But you said it's broader than that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Then there's what's called network-based exposure. This is all about how disruptions can, ripple through an M&E's entire network.
You mean like suppliers and partners?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Supply chains, international alliances. So a company might have zero physical presence in the conflict zone itself, but still get hit really hard indirectly.
Which challenges the old risk models, I bet.
Totally. It demands a much wider lens on vulnerability.
Uh-huh.
And it's interesting, people talk about this conceptually, but there's surprisingly little hard empirical research on it yet.
Huh. Okay, so distance, networks, what else?
Well, then you have the wider ripple effects.
Okay.
Within the country that's affected, you obviously get macroeconomic problems, labor market issues, social order breaking down, infrastructure damage, all that stuff.
Yeah, the direct consequences.
But the ripples go global. Think about conflict in places that produce key commodities or major trade routes.
Like the Red Sea crisis recently.
Perfect example. That hits companies like Whirlpool, affecting their supply chains, even if they're miles away from the actual conflict.
Right. And then there are things like Refugee crises, international sanctions, maybe.
Absolutely. Sanctions imposed on countries sponsoring terrorism, for instance. These are all other kinds of ripple effects that MNEs have to navigate, far from the battlefield itself.
Okay, this is already much more complex than I thought.
And there's one more layer. Conflict-generated social pressures.
Mean.
Public opinion. If people see one side in a conflict as, unjust, there can be huge social pressure on companies to take a stand, to respond, even if they aren't physically affected at all.
Ah, like we saw with Western companies pulling out of Russia after the invasion of Ukraine.
Exactly that. It was a massive wave of exits, signaling their position. And what's really interesting is how these perceptions, this public sentiment, can actually change the informal rules of the game for businesses.
Hmm.
The expectations shift.
That's a really crucial point. So understanding all these different ways MNEs are exposed, distance, network, ripple, social pressure, it's not just academic theory, is it?
Not at all. It's vital for policy.
How so?
Well, it can help governments figure out how to better support their MNEs operating abroad, and also how to attract and keep foreign investment, even in potentially risky regions.
And for the companies themselves.
It means they can really sharpen their own risk assessments, get a much more realistic picture of what they might face.
Okay, so if they're exposed in all these different complex ways, how do MNEs actually strategize? What do they do when faced with this kind of conflict? Do they just run, or is it more nuanced?
That's the next big question, yeah. Because they aren't just passive targets. The sources basically outline two main approaches.
Okay.
There's the reactive approach, which is mostly about adapting to the conflict. And then there's a proactive approach, where companies might actually try to influence the situation or even the conflict itself.
Let's take the reactive one first. Adapting. What does that look like?
So this view treats the conflict as something external, an exogenous shock in academic terms. Basically something you can't control.
Right, so you work around it.
Exactly. The goal is adaptation. Yeah. And the first step is that detailed exposure analysis we just talked about. You need to know how you're vulnerable.
Makes sense.
Then, the kind of adjustments you make depend on how you're exposed. It could be anything from shifting resources at a facility that's directly affected, all the way to reconfiguring your entire global supply chain, or maybe changing your PR strategy to manage how people see you.
It reminds me of like building a house in an earthquake zone.
How so?
Well, it's usually cheaper and smarter to build in the earthquake-resistant stuff from the start rather than trying to fix it after the shaking starts.
That's a great analogy, and it highlights a really key point: preparedness.
Ah, so it's not just reacting after something happens.
Precisely. Preparedness needs to be part of the strategy itself, not just mitigation afterwards. Things like doing regular risk assessments, including your suppliers, your transport routes, building redundancy into your supply chain, having backup suppliers, setting up disaster response plans, training employees.
But that sounds like a big shift in thinking for some managers, maybe.
It can be. The challenge is getting managers to see conflicts not as these incredibly rare black swan events, but as things you actually need to prepare for proactively.
Okay, so that's reacting and preparing. What about the other side being proactive?
Right. So connecting this to the bigger picture, MNEs aren't always just victims. They can potentially play a role in shaping the environment, even in conflict zones.
How would they do that?
Through things like corporate political activity, lobbying governments, maybe forming alliances with political groups, or even getting involved in public-private partnerships aimed at conflict resolution.
Interesting.
And there's this whole field of research called business and peace. It looks at how MNEs can actually contribute to peace building.
Like how?
Maybe by supporting advocacy groups, or by fostering trade links that create economic interdependence, or even providing jobs for former fighters after a conflict ends, helping with reconstruction.
Wow. Is there much evidence of this happening?
Well, conceptually, it's a rich area. But again, the sources point out there's a surprising lack of solid empirical research actually testing these ideas. It's a bit of a gap. But it connects directly to things like the UN's Sustainable Development Goals, specifically SDG 16, which is all about peace, justice, and strong institutions.
And what pushes a company to go down this proactive route? Is it just about their own interests?
It can be a mix of things. Self-interest, sure. But also maybe the economic importance of that region to the company, or the specific nature of the conflict.
And can governments encourage this?
Yeah, public policies can definitely play a role, offering incentives like tax breaks, or maybe just the reputational boost that comes from being seen as a constructive player.
Okay.
And another thing to consider here is timing. How did these responses change depending on whether a conflict is just brewing or if it's fully escalated or maybe winding down?
Ah, so a strategy that works early on might be useless later?
Exactly. Peace-building efforts might be feasible in a pre-conflict stage,
Uh-huh.
but maybe impossible once fighting really breaks out. Understanding that timing is critical.
So ultimately, thinking about MNE strategies, it seems governments have a really significant role here too.
Absolutely. They shape the overall environment, through rule of law, investment policies, infrastructure,
Mm.
and they can actively bring MNEs into the picture, leverage their resources for conflict resolution through partnerships and the right kinds of incentives.
Okay, so we've talked about exposure and we've talked about strategies reacting, preparing, being proactive. What about the results? What does this all actually mean for the companies and for the societies they operate in? What are the outcomes?
Good question. So first, looking just at the MNE itself, there's a real need to figure out how effective these different strategies actually are.
Right. Do they actually work?
Yeah. In terms of, say, how quickly a company recovers, how much loss they manage to avoid, their resilience over the long term, and surprisingly, the direct link between being exposed to conflict and how the firm actually performs financially, short-term or long-term, that link is actually quite under-researched.
Really? That seems fundamental.
It does, yeah. It's an area needing more work.
Okay. And what about beyond the company? The wider social impacts?
This is where it gets really complex. The sources talk about the Janus face of MNEs in conflict zones.
Janus face, like the two-faced Roman god.
Exactly. It's a powerful idea because it suggests MNEs can be both victims of conflict, but also sometimes contributors to it.
Okay, let's break that down. The positive side first.
On the positive side, you have MNEs getting involved in peace building, like we discussed.
Right.
The challenge here, though, is proving it, what they call causal attribution. How do you separate out the impact of normal business activities from specific peace-building efforts? It's tricky. The links might be indirect or delayed or mixed up with lots of other factors.
Okay, that makes sense. What about the negative side of the Janus face?
This is where MNEs might engage in unethical practices, or maybe even unintentionally end up supporting armed groups.
How could that happen?
Well, for instance, the head of ethical buying at Lush, the UK retailer, admitted once that businesses often struggle to protect human rights properly in conflict or post-conflict areas. This is very difficult.
Mm.
And even more fundamentally, sometimes M&E operations themselves can become a root cause of conflict.
A root cause.
Think about community grievances over how resources are shared, or environmental damage from, say, mining or drilling, or maybe dodgy political dealings, corruption.
Wow.
The sources mention a statistic that something like 40% of civil wars in the last 60 years have been linked to natural resource industries.
40%. That's huge.
It is. And what's fascinating here is how standard business practices, things seen as perfectly normal or even good in stable countries, can look very different or even be harmful in a conflict zone.
Can you give an example?
Well, in places where government institutions are weak or absent, what academics call institutional voids, MNEs might step in and take on roles the state usually handles just to make business possible.
Like providing security or basic services.
Yeah, stuff like that, which might seem necessary on the ground, but back in their home country or to other groups, it could look like they're getting way too involved politically, maybe overstepping.
So it's incredibly important for MNEs to understand this context then.
Absolutely vital. They need to understand what might lead to problematic behavior, even unintentional behavior, and develop what the paper calls conflict-sensitive practices.
Which means?
Really engaging widely with all the stakeholders, local communities, government, civil society, to try and avoid those unintended negative consequences. Tailoring what they do to actively support peace, or at least not make things worse.
And the policy implications of this Janus face.
They're significant. It really points to the need to better connect international law, things like investment law, human rights law, with practical business insights.
Okay.
And using our understanding of how MNEs impact specific sectors like natural resources or maybe the arms trade to help governments build their own capacity and promote responsible business conduct.
Mm.
The UN human rights recommendations for the arms sector are an example of that kind of thinking.
You know, digging into all this, it really highlights how crucial good data and good research methods are.
Totally. To really understand these dynamics, the paper stresses using robust conflict data sets like from UCDP, the Uppsala Conflict Data Program, or ACLED. These groups meticulously track conflict events globally.
Right.
And using rigorous research methods, things like difference indifferences or instrumental variables, to actually try and pin down cause and effect, not just correlations.
Which leads to a bigger question, I guess. How does all this academic research actually make a difference in the real world?
Yeah, that's a key point the authors raise. They make a really strong call for researchers in international business, IB scholars, to focus not just on academic rigor for its own sake,
Hmm.
but on achieving real societal impact. They want research to generate concrete, usable insights for public policy, things that policymakers and M&E executives can actually pick up and use, not just theoretical statements.
So let's try and wrap up our deep dive today. What are the main takeaways?
Well, I think the big picture is that violent conflict is this growing, very costly, and incredibly complex global issue.
Yeah.
And it hits multinational companies in all these different ways, way beyond just direct physical damage through their networks, global ripples, social pressures.
Right. And companies aren't just passive, they have a whole range of strategies, from reacting and preparing to proactively trying to build peace or influence things.
Exactly. And crucially, whatever they do has real consequences for society, both good and bad. That Janus face idea.
It really captures the complexity.
So maybe a final thought to leave you with. Given this huge global impact of violent conflict, how do you think businesses should ethically balance their own financial goals with their potential? Their potential to either make things worse or to actually help reduce suffering and instability in these really volatile places?
That's a tough question, but a really important one. It definitely challenges us all to think about what responsible global business actually means in a world that seems to be getting more turbulent. Thanks for joining us on the deep dive.